All right, sorry guys, we had a little bit of technical difficulties with the Zoom on the last one, so I was just finishing up the gland slide, or this gland slide. I was saying that the sebum is not only protective against drying, but it also protects against bacteria. So we'll also talk about sweat glands. There's two different types. We have eccrine and apocrine. The type that I already pointed out are an eccrine sweat gland. They're those coiled tubes, and they go all the way to the surface by merocrine secretion. Again, you don't necessarily need to know that. We have them in almost every part of our skin, but the most are on our palms and our soles. So when you get those clammy, sweaty hands, that is the reason. They produce a secretion that is mostly water with just very few salts. So our eccrine sweat glands have ducts that open all the way right to the surface of the skin, and sweating is one way that we regulate our temperature. Our sweat can also be released in our palms and soles. Like I said, that's where they're most numerous, our armpits and other places because of emotional stress. The other type of sweat gland that we have is an apocrine sweat gland. And so these are also coiled tubes, and they secrete a more thick sweat. And so these glands open right into our hair follicles within the armpit and genitalia. So they open similar to our sebaceous glands rather than directly to the surface like our eccrine glands. And these only become active once we hit puberty and our sex hormones are more present. And so the secretion itself is odorless, but when bacteria on the surface of our skin breaks it down, that's what actually causes body odor. So we have our eccrine sweat gland right to the skin. And then if we had an apocrine sweat gland, it would open to the follicle similar to a sebaceous gland, but they look very similar. All right, the nails. The nail's a thin plate. It's letters of dead stratum corneum, so similar to the top layer of our epithelium. It's these dead cells that are keratinized, and in this case, a very hard type of keratin, so fully hardened. So the visible part of our nail is what is termed the nail body, and then we have a portion of the nail that's covered by our skin still, and this is the nail root. We also have our cuticle, also known as the eponychium, and this is what extends onto the nail body, and then the nail root is going to extend distally from that nail matrix. So the nail attaches to the underlying nail bed, which is the tissue underneath of our nail. The nail matrix and our nail bed are epithelial tissue. And so that basal layer is what gives cells or where new cells come from to form the nail. So within the nail matrix, just like our skin, new cells are coming from the stratum basale, the basal layer. A small part of the nail matrix is known as the lunula, and this is that whitish part of the nail body down towards the bottom portion of the nail. It looks kind of like a crescent moon. That's your lunula. And we just said cell production happens at the nail matrix, and that's why our nails continue to grow. So the nail body is this main portion of our nail. This white portion is the lunula. The lunula. Our cuticle is kind of where our skin and nail meet, more or less. We have the nail root that extends under the skin. The free edge is this top portion of our nail. And I think that's all the major things to point out for our nails. Okay, so at the very beginning of the lecture, we discussed the functions of the integumentary system. And so we said one of the major ones was protection. So it reduces body water loss. That dead stratum corneum, that outer layer, forms a seal to help prevent water loss. It also acts as a barrier to prevent microorganisms like bacteria and viruses from entering our body. It's going to protect us against physical harm like an abrasion. And then melanin and our melanocytes are going to protect us from the ultraviolet light in terms of providing tint and pigment to our skin. excuse me. Our hair also performs a protective function. The hair on our head is an insulator for us. Eyebrows can help keep sweat and other particles out of the eyes, similar to our eyelashes. And then we have hair in our nose and our ears that are going to help prevent entry of dust and other small particles into our respiratory system or auditory pathway. And then finally, we have our nails at the end of our fingers and toes that can also be used for protection and in defense. So I mentioned the presence of nerves and tactile cells within the dermis. So we have many sensory receptors that are associated with the skin. These receptors lie both in the epidermis and dermis, primarily the dermis, and we have different specialized receptors for different sensations like pain, temperature, pressure, vibration. So hair does not have a direct nerve supply, but because sensory receptors are so numerous in the epidermis and the dermis, there's always going to be a sensory receptor nearby a hair follicle. And so if you brush your hair nice and light, even if you don't touch your skin, you can still sense that movement or touch on the hair. Another thing that we mentioned earlier was vitamin D production. So this is just a little bit more step-by-step how that pathway occurs. So when we're out in the light, the UV light causes our skin to produce a precursor molecule of vitamin D. So a molecule needed to create or synthesize vitamin D. So this precursor molecule is created in the skin, and then our blood carries it to the liver. In the liver, it's converted to a different molecule, and then it goes to the kidneys. It's converted again to activate vitamin D. Vitamin D stimulates our small intestine to absorb calcium and phosphate, which are used for many body functions, but primarily this is how we maintain our bone health. So you do not need to know this step by step by any means. You should really just know that UV light is going to cause the skin to produce a precursor molecule of vitamin D, and without that precursor molecule, we cannot utilize vitamin D. Temperature regulation is another function that we mentioned earlier. So this is really important because of the chemical reactions that occur within the body. And so when our temperature goes up, those reaction times tend to increase. When our temperature goes down, our reactions tend to slow down. So even small changes are going to make enzymes and other reactions less efficient. So exercise, fever, increase in environmental temperature, all of those can lead to an increase in temperature. Remember, we talked about homeostasis with our normal range and our set point in our first unit. So we only have a small window where our body really likes to function temperature-wise before we're kind of out of whack. So typically the way that we are going to regulate temperature is either to get rid of excess heat or try to maintain heat within the body. So if we want to get rid of excess heat, our blood vessels within our dermis are going to dilate, which means to widen, and that's going to enable more blood flow to the skin. So more blood flow is going to bring more of our heat towards the surface, and it's going to dissipate into the environment. Sweat can also help us dissipate heat or cool down because our sweat evaporates off the skin, which causes cooling. Now, we can also use these mechanisms, or especially our blood flow, if we are becoming too cold. So if we drop below normal temperature, the blood vessels within our dermis are going to constrict or get more narrow, which reduces blood flow to the skin. Less heat is going to be lost to the environment because we're going to keep it in our deeper structures. So this just shows an illustration of this. If we need to cool down, the blood vessels in our dermis towards the surface of our skin are going to get more blood flow because then we can lose more heat to the environment. If we want to stay warmer, then we're going to minimize how much blood flows to the surface and we'll keep it in this deeper artery. So less heat is going to the environment. The integumentary system also plays a small role in excretion of waste products. So some things that are excreted with waste are water, salt, urea, uric acid, and ammonia. So these three are really just byproducts of our metabolism. So our body can lose a large amount of sweat, but our sweat really doesn't contain a lot of our waste products. We mentioned a couple things earlier, but remember our skin can help us in diagnosis because there are some obvious changes that go with certain pathologies or diagnoses. And this is what we mentioned earlier, cyanosis, that's the blue color of the skin. So the reason for that is going to be decreased oxygen content within the blood. So for some reason, either our circulatory system is not getting enough oxygen to our tissues, or our respiratory system is not bringing in enough oxygen to get to the blood. Another very common one is a yellowing of the skin called jaundice. This is typically going to be due to liver damage, whether that's from a liver disease or some other cause that is preventing the liver from functioning properly. So jaundice is a yellowing of the skin. You can see it very well in the whites of someone's eyes often. It's pretty obvious if you see it in someone who has a poor functioning liver. Some other examples are rashes and lesions in the skin, which may give clue to what is happening elsewhere in the body. Okay, burns we'll talk about with the skin. So this is going to be injury to a tissue. It's not always just sunburn or a heat burn. You can get cold burns, which is frostbite. You can get friction burns, chemical burns, electrical burns, or radiation burns. And we classify burns based on how deep they go into our skin layers. So partial thickness are going to be first and second degree, whereas a full thickness burn is going to be a third degree burn. So the higher the degree, the worse the burn. So first degree, just the epidermis, that's your normal sunburn. Second degree, that's the dermis. So you typically are going to have some type of blistering or something associated with it, not just your normal redness. And then full thickness is going to extend all the way into the subcutaneous tissue, and that can be super dangerous. Okay, the last thing we'll discuss here is aging and our integumentary system. So as we get older, our blood flow decreases. Our heart's not quite as good at pumping our blood throughout the body. Our skin becomes thinner, and we have decreased amounts of collagen. Our sebaceous and sweat glands are less active, which affects skin hydration as well as affects the efficiency of our temperature regulation systems. We also lose elastic fibers, which is why our skin begins to sag and wrinkle. So less collagen, less elastic, so our skin loses some of that structure. Okay, so that is chapter 5. Remember, this is our first one for unit 2. So your unit 1 exam will have chapter 1 through 4, and then unit 2 is chapter 5, 6, and 7.